everyone. Welcome to the virtual Vegas Bank of America Healthcare Conference. I'm Greg Harrison, one of the biotech analysts here at B of A. And it's my pleasure today to welcome Ivor Macleod, CFO of Athersys. Ivor is going to start off with a presentation for about half the session or so, and then we can jump into Q&A. Ivor?
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon, everybody. And as Greg said, I'm Ivor Macleod, Chief Financial Officer of Athersys, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for joining. I will go through a brief presentation. I believe you have the slides, and I'll give the numbers as I go through, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So first of all, on slide 2, I will be making some statements that are covered under Safe Harbor. But I want to refer you to our SEC filings for more information. So slide 3, excuse me. So Athersys, we are based in Cleveland, Ohio. Our NASDAQ symbol ATHX. We are recognized as a leader in the rapidly emerging cell therapy and regenerative medicine space. We are focused on the critical care space of the healthcare market, which is particularly exciting because it's an area where, quite honestly, the standard of care is, in most cases, pretty poor, and in some cases, non-existent. So the opportunity to have an impact on that space is very, very exciting. At Athersys, internally, we have 3 ongoing clinical studies. Our first and most advanced program is the MASTERS-2 study in ischemic stroke, and I'll give a little bit more detail on that in the coming moments. The second is our ARD study, or Macleod study, which is for general pathogen-induced ARDS. And then last is our phase 2 trauma trial. We are also in a partnership with a Japanese company, Helios, and they are partnering with us in the commercialization development, I should say, and commercialization in the 2 lead indications, ischemic stroke and acute respiratory distress syndrome. Their acute respiratory distress syndrome study, or OneBridge study, they announced full enrollment in that at the end of March this year. And with a 28-day endpoint, we expect data from that very, very soon. The Treasure study, they're more than 90% enrolled, so we expect data from that by the end of this year. Again, we're very excited about that. So moving on to slide 4, we have a very experienced executive leadership team. The 2 most recent additions, myself as Chief Financial Officer last year. I bring about 30 years of pharmaceutical experience, both in Europe and the US. And then the other addition was Maya Hansen, who joined us actually from McKinsey & Company, where she was a senior partner in charge of the Cleveland office. And we're very excited to have her on board as the SVP of Operations and Supply Chain. Moving on to slide 5, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the product for those of you who are not familiar with it. First of all, our core technology is cells that are derived from the bone marrow of healthy adult donors. No ethical concerns whatsoever. These cells themselves, they have robust and distinctive growth properties, highly scalable. So it's actually possible to produce 1 million or so doses from a single healthy adult donor, which is very significant. We're based on proprietary MAPC, multi-adult progenitor cells, tripped up there. And we have over 300 patents on various areas, methods of use, production, etc. The cells themselves, and I'll come back to exactly how they're administered in a moment, but it's an off-the-shelf therapy, and we have stability data of more than 8 years. So moving to slide 6, as I said, a practical and easy to administer. First of all, you take the vial out of the freezer, you thaw the vial, and then you extract the product and put it into a bag of saline, and then it is administered intravenously into the patient. What's most significant here is it is rather like administering O-type blood. There's no tissue matching, no immune suppression required, and it's the same dose for every patient. So it's very easy to administer. It can be done in the trauma center, the ICU, anywhere by any technician, which is really a positive. Moving on to slide 7, whereas traditional pharmaceutical products have a single mode of action, what we've shown is, in combination with a number of different scientific groups, the mechanisms of action. There are multiple mechanisms of action. The cells that comprise our multi-stem product, they downregulate the hyperinflammatory cascade that occurs after a stroke or a trauma or a cytokine storm that's causing pulmonary dysfunction. But in addition to that, they upregulate the healing mechanisms and pathways that help the body and the patient recover. We have a very deep knowledge base about how these cells promote the healing and recovery, and there are dozens of publications in leading peer-reviewed journals based on the work that we've done with many independent research teams. Moving on to slide 8, this is a high-level view of our regenerative medicine pipeline. And what I'm talking about today is really the later stage programs, but you can see that in the earlier stage, there are multiple areas with the opportunity for us to investigate. Things like spinal cord injury, multiple sclerosis, etc. We're in the cardiovascular and the neurological space, but as I said before, our major focus is critical care. So moving on to slide 9, this is to talk a little bit more about our MASTERS-2 study. It's a 300-patient, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study. We're looking at enrolling people with moderately to severe strokes, an NIHSS score of 8 to 20 at the baseline. And it's a 90-day primary clinical assessment. And what we're looking as the primary endpoint is the MRS shift. We're looking for an MRS of less than 1 at 90 days. Patients will actually also be evaluated at a year. What has been shown with multi-stem, and actually we experienced in our earlier studies, was that while it's normally clinically observed that within 90 days, most stroke patients are as good as they're going to get. What we have found with multi-stem is that improvement continues over time, such that at a 1-year follow-up, patients were actually doing much better than at the 90 days. Now, we believe a reason for this is that multi-stem inhibits the scarring and deposition of inhibitory substances like glycosaminoglycans, or GAGs for short. These are known to inhibit neurological repair and recovery. And by inhibiting this, multi-stem is able to establish an environment that's more conducive for long-term neurological repair. So that's our MASTERS-2 study. And we have actually been fairly successful with regard to enrollment, but I have to say that COVID-19 did actually slow us down a bit, and some sites actually shut down enrollment altogether. Gradually, they're coming back online, but we do expect to be fully enrolled in the MASTERS-2 study sometime next year. Our partner Helios, they are also investigating ischemic stroke, and this is the TREASURE study. It's 220 patients. Their primary endpoint is actually excellent outcome, a little bit different from ours, but excellent outcome is actually a secondary endpoint for us. But excellent outcome is defined as the MRS less than or equal to 1, NIHSS score less than or equal to 1, and the Bartel index greater than or equal to 95. These are the 3 major indices of functional assessments for stroke patients. And as I said before, they expect to be fully enrolled relatively soon. So it's quite exciting because we'll have stroke data hopefully before the end of this year. Moving on to acute respiratory distress syndrome, our Macleod study. This is a 400-patient study, and it's actually initially was for COVID-19 induced ARDS, but we have recently expanded the protocol to be for just general pathogen-induced ARDS. And that study we actually began in May of last year, and it's continuing. We also expect this one to be enrolled next year, probably after Masters 2 is fully enrolled. Helios, our partner in Japan, they have their OneBridge study. As I said, they announced full enrollment at the end of March, and with a 28-day endpoint, we do expect data on this relatively soon. It's a small study, 30 patients, open label, but they also had a small cohort of 5 patients to evaluate specific COVID-19 induced ARDS. And while that one was fully enrolled at the end of August, they actually decided to publish the data all at once. And like I say, we expect that relatively soon. The last study is actually our trauma study. We are enrolling at UT Health, which is a leading tier 1 trauma center in the US. And the funding is provided by the Department of Defense, MTech, and the Memorial Hermann Foundation. Again, it's a phase 2 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study, approximately 150 patients. And this one, we're comparing all-cause mortality at 30 days in multiply injured post-hemorrhage patients administered multistem versus patients administered placebo. And this one we announced December of last year, and so far things are going really very well. So that was a rather quick overview, but with that, let me turn it back over to Greg, and we'll have a Q&A session. Thank you, Greg.
Great, thank you for that, Ivor. So I guess, the most near-term catalyst I think people are looking forward to is the Helios OneBridge study data in ARDS. So the question I have about it is, given that it's single arm, how will you interpret the study success, relative to what you guys have shown in phase 2, and just what is your expectation there for a good outcome?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, we're very excited at the possibility of the data coming out in relatively near term. You're right, it's open label, no placebo. And success for us would be continued demonstration of tolerability, some evidence of clinical impact, ventilator-free days, time off the ventilator, but most importantly, consistency with the observations that we had in our earlier study. Now, it's interesting to point out that this could be enough for conditional approval in Japan, but for approval in the US, more than likely, we would need a much larger double-blind placebo-controlled study like our Macleod study. But as I say, we're very excited to have that data relatively soon.
Okay, and then, assuming a positive outcome from the Helios study, what do you think that the read across to your Macleod trial should be? People are obviously going to be closely scrutinizing the Helios data and trying to figure out what that means for your study. So, in terms of, the overall efficacy in the Helios study, how would you expect that to translate over, just given any differences in the trial as well as the underlying patient population?
Yeah, thank you. Honestly, limited read across to our Macleod study, just by virtue of the size, etc. But we are looking to see trends, directions, and most importantly, consistency with past results. So some read across, but very limited just by virtue of the size. And the open label studies, they're viewed a little bit differently in the US than they are in Japan. So, but all that being said, consistency with the earlier results, it's nothing but positive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. And then, when you look at the COVID arm in this study, it is only 5 patients, but how are you thinking about those results? And maybe you can talk a little bit about your own COVID program, given that the focus of Macovia has definitely shifted towards ARDS from non-COVID sources. But just wanted to get your thinking around that.
Yeah, sure. Of course, with just 5 patients, it's difficult to draw any real conclusion. And there is the possibility of doing further work in COVID-19. For us here in the U.S., things have changed dramatically. We initially began the specific COVID-19-induced ARDS study with the expectation of receiving government funding. Things have changed dramatically with regard to COVID-19. Doctors and healthcare professionals are doing whatever they can appropriately to actually delay putting patients on the ventilators as much as possible. And there are therapies going in now. Of course, there are vaccines. So the landscape has changed dramatically. And while we do believe our therapy has an impact on specific COVID-19-induced ARDS, we saw greater possibility for general pathogen-induced ARDS because our therapy is pathogen agnostic. And ARDS has got a lot of publicity by virtue of COVID-19, but influenza-induced ARDS, pneumonia-induced ARDS, tens of thousands of people die every year from these, in addition to COVID-19. So we think with just general pathogen-induced ARDS, we have the opportunity for a much broader label and, as a consequence, a much more beneficial product.
Okay. But do you think it would be possible if your study is, more agnostic to the cause of ARDS, that it would be actually able to be used in COVID if it does become endemic and a repeating concern over time?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And of course, having started, I don't know if we have a sufficiently large cohort in specific COVID-19-induced ARDS, but yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. And then can you help us with, the pace of enrollment you're seeing in the Macovia trial and maybe a little bit about the ultimate end market there, outside of COVID? I think that's something, a lot of people probably are not really aware of how common it is for, people to experience ARDS from pneumonia or the flu. And so if you could talk about maybe the market opportunity that you see there.
Yeah, thanks. The market itself, pretty significant. 500,000 or so cases in the US, Japan, and Europe combined on an annual basis. So a tremendous commercial opportunity, if you will. And our therapy, while getting patients off the ventilator relatively quickly, the one-year follow-up, looking at things like the NIHSS score, MRS shift, Bartel index, and everything, people don't realize that when patients get off the ventilator, there are quite a number of patients who are suffering in addition to what they initially experienced. So things like fibrosis, pulmonary dysfunction. What we found is that we're actually able to improve the quality of life 1 year post treatment. And as a consequence, our proposition to healthcare reimbursers is pretty substantial. So we feel that we would be able to justify a fairly decent price. And like I say, it's a pretty sizable market. And as a consequence, we've had interest from a number of multinational pharma companies definitely interested in that space.
Great. Maybe we can transition here to the stroke trial. We're looking forward to Helios data later on this year. Given that that's a much larger trial compared to their ARDS trial, what read-through would you see there from their Treasure trial to your Masters 2 trial? Just given that yours is a ways behind there, and so that would, people definitely want to look at the Helios trial and see what that implies for the success of your trial.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a great question, and we're very excited about Treasure. Highly, highly relevant. 220 patients. The protocols are virtually identical. The targeted patient population, we're both targeting moderate to severe, so NIHSS score 8 to 20. In terms of the endpoints, while their primary endpoint is excellent outcome, that's actually a secondary endpoint for us. So there's a lot of similarities, but we do see this as a major relevant item with regard to de-risking our Masters 2. In terms of differences, if there are some differences, it's really in the standard of care. Lower reperfusion therapy utilization potentially in Japan, things like TPA, mechanical thrombectomy. And then strokes in Japan tend to happen to a much older population. So there are some differences, but this one we're most excited about. Very, very relevant.
Okay. Great. And then you touched on the search for a partner for EU commercialization. Can you give us an update on the latest there, and kind of your hopes for what the timing would be, and how that could be impacted by the coming Helios readout?
Yeah, no, a great question. We get this question a lot. You're absolutely right. Our prime interest, first of all, is finding a partner, and we're discussing with a number of potential partners, somebody who's interested in general in the critical care space. So not necessarily around a specific indication, because it's the same product pretty much for all these indications. So we want someone who's looking at the critical care space, and our prime interest is finding a commercialization partner in the European territories with the potential for additional territories. In terms of timing, that's a very, very difficult one, because potential timings have been given out before, and we've only disappointed. But what I can say is that the ARDS data, if consistent with what we have seen in our earlier studies, that is a potential de-risking event. And the potential partners that we've been talking to with regard to ARDS are not necessarily looking for the outcome of the Macleod study. They are interested in partnering with us prior to that, and in fact contributing to the development of that. Stroke is a little bit different, and in terms of de-risking that, yes, partners would like to see the Treasure data. So is it possible for us to do something before the end of the year? It's possible. But again, with positive data, first of all from ARDS, but definitely with positive data from Treasure, we'd be able to command a much more significant license fee, which would be, of course, much more beneficial to shareholders, etc.
Okay. And then your other indication that you're working on is trauma. So maybe if you could talk about how the patient population there stacks up against your other indications in terms of, the addressable population, technical probability of success, that sort of thing. Just given the very different cause of ARDS or other injury that needs to be addressed in these patients.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So what's not broadly known is that trauma is actually the leading cause of death or serious disability in the population under 45 years old. And so while how do I say this? Mechanistically, the hyperinflammatory response following trauma is pretty much the same as for stroke, with similar effects. So we have the opportunity to have a big impact here. Trauma itself encompasses a number of important sub-areas: traumatic brain injury, hemorrhagic shock, spinal cord injury, acute kidney injury. The possibilities are enormous, quite honestly. And we believe we have a good probability of clinical success in these areas based on the hypothesis of dampening the hyperinflammatory response. Our study itself, we're delighted to be partnering with UT Health, as I said before, a Tier 1 trauma center, and sponsored by Memorial Hermann, but also by the Department of Defense, MTech. The Department of Defense, of course, significantly interested in the possibility of treating traumatic injury. And we're delighted to be able to assist there. So this one, though, our responsibility is really just to provide the product. So we're not actually managing the overall development. But we do look forward to good results here because, these subjects have high morbidity and mortality. So it really is the possibility for us to create tremendous patient value creation.
Great. Okay. Well, now that we've discussed your various programs in the clinic, maybe just as a last question, we can talk about your cash burn and kind of your plans as far as that goes with maybe these Helios readouts or partnership definitely could affect your timing for your next financing.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a good question. As of the end of first quarter, we had a little over 64 million in cash. Our burn the last 2 quarters has been pretty steady, around 17 million. We feel confident that there is enough cash to get us through, at the very least, the publication of the treasure data. There are a number of opportunities for the input of non-dilutive capital, be it milestone payments from Helios, potential partner. But you raise the possibility of a capital raise on the back of positive stroke data. That's entirely possible. So, we definitely look forward to that. But we're in reasonably good shape, I would say, as of now. And actually, if I could give a shout out to our long-term shareholders, we certainly do appreciate your support. We thank you for hanging with us. And quite honestly, this is the year. This really could be a tremendous year for us.
Great. Well, thank you for that. With that, we're about at the end of our session here. I'd like to thank you, Ivor, for joining us and sharing the Athersys story with everyone on the line. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today as well.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thanks.